Our God, even Yahweh that dwells in the heavens above, we bow before thee as we come aside at this time to look into thy word of truth, to see that hope that thou hast written aforetime that we can learn of and understand and be prepared for when thy Son returns. And we pray that that day be soon, for we realize this world and we need thy Son's return. We seek that day and we seek thy care upon us this evening as we learn of these things that were spoken a long time ago. Help us to understand, to learn, and be ready. In thy Son's name, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. So we'll read from Revelation chapter 16, the first 11 verses. And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the seven angels, go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters say, thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And I heard another out of the altar say, even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments. And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with the great heat and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues. And they repented not to give him glory. And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom and was full of darkness. And they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not their deeds. So that intro, we'll ask Brother Dan to present his class tonight.
Thanks for that, Nathan, and good evening, everybody. I'm suspicious there's something wrong with that side of the hall. The entire meeting feels a bit lopsided tonight. Maybe it's just no one wants to sit next to Ben. Oops, we'll have to fix that up. Not sure, but oh, it's Kim, is it? Okay. Sure, it's nothing of the sort, but nonetheless. All right, let's just work out what happened there. We're back. Good. All right. So, Brother John wasn't able to do his class tonight. So I'm bringing up part 2, and that's good because we needed time to get through some more. So we'll dive right in without preamble. You remember we're talking about those sort of shallow bowls filled with the wrath of God being poured out upon predominantly Catholic Europe. And you'll remember those bowls were meaningful to people in the time of John. They were meaningful because in every Greek, every Roman home, you would see people using those bowls every morning with prayer. And so the connection would be obvious to people at this time. And so what we're going to see, and what we do see in Revelation 16, is an incredibly busy period for the angels. You can almost see busloads of angels shuttling in every day to deal with what's going on in the history of Europe at this point in time. And this point is not mistaken on historians. David Thompson, writing in his book, Europe Since Napoleon, says, describing the significance of the French Revolution, he says, perhaps the final significance of the quarter century of turmoil, speaking of Napoleonic history, is that too much history happened in too short a time. And that's always people's complaint about this section of Revelation. Too much happens in too short a time. Now, just a quick point about the way the vials are poured. It does seem initially kind of like, well, they're just splashed around the place. Who knows where these vials are going? But there is a kind of order to it when you look through them. So the first vial that we covered in our last class was the one, it's the ulcerous sore, the weeping sore. And really, the open wound is France. It affects all of Europe, as we'll go over it again in a minute, but the sore itself is France. Then we have the Sea Vial. Now, again, this affects all of Europe, but who is worst affected? Well, the largest contributor to the European economy at this time, making up almost 25% of European income, was the silver trade out of South America coming into Spain and Portugal. When the vial that went upon the sea made the seas like blood, as it were, it fell predominantly upon Spain and Portugal, which made such incredible wealth out of the suffering of slaves in South America. Yes, all Europe will be impacted, as we will see, but it falls predominantly on Catholic, very Catholic, Spain and Portugal. And then the rivers and the fountains. This is now the third vial in verse 4, the one upon the rivers and the fountains. Well, where is the rivers and fountains? We'll go through this in more detail, but the rivers and fountains is predominantly that territory around the Alps. where the rivers and fountains flow out of, the source of those rivers and fountains. It's those sort of alpine regions. And of course, that is northern Italy and southern France. Then we have the Sea Vial. We'll get to this in time, but this is going to fall again upon all of Catholic Europe, but predominantly upon the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire of the time. And then finally, we'll come to the vial on the seat of the beast, and that's going to fall mostly on the Papal States. And yes, affect all of Europe, but there is a, where is the vial poured over? In this case, the Papal States. And so there's a kind of logical order to which these vials are poured out. Each region is being targeted by Christ for specific judgment. So in our last class, we noted, firstly, the Holy Roman Empire was going to be a target. And we talked about how Charlemagne started off the Holy Roman Empire, and we went through the history, how it shifted eastward into Europe. And I said that the Holy Roman Empire, by the time we arrive on the scene in the 1790s, has become fundamentally, it's not an empire, it's a patchwork quilt of kingdoms. And in fact, the emperor was elected from among the lords. He wasn't a dynastic emperor as such. He got elected, and each time one died, they had to choose another one. Now, often there were reasons to choose the emperor's son, but nonetheless, it was a mess, and it was only held together by twine and chewing gum fundamentally. It was ready to collapse by the time Napoleon arrived upon the scene. We're going to talk about Portugal and Spain a little bit more, and as we covered in our last class, they were making incredible wealth from this strange line that the Pope had drawn on a world map. And we saw this line it's really effective for the Spanish and for the Portuguese, because it divided up the world for them and allowed them to feel like they had the moral right to bleed these places dry. And that's exactly what they did. And we said this happened in the Treaty of Tordesillas, the division of the world. And so we looked at that, and we could see how the green represents the Portugal, the blue there represents Spanish territory, and that exactly follows the line drawn by the Pope. That's why Brazil is the only country in South America that speaks Portuguese. All the rest speak Spanish. And of course, this was hugely lucrative. Silver and gold in vast amounts were pillaged out of these places, let alone precious timbers, spices, sugar, and the like. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. Obviously, we covered France last week. We looked very briefly at the three estates, two of those estates, the first estate, the clergy, the second estate, the aristocracy riding on the backs of the third estate, everybody else, including every one of you and me, if we were in France at that time. A terrible state of affairs, and Europe was ready for change, and France in particular. The Papal States and Italy in particular. Look, Italy it wasn't Italy at this point in time. It was, again, a patchwork of states. So there was the Kingdom of Sardinia and the Kingdom of Sicily and the Republic of Genoa. There was the Venetian Republic, and so on and so on and so on. And not only were these ruled by different rulers, often there were different countries which owned these territories. So, for example, big parts of the territory around Milan was owned by the Austrians at this point in time. This Kingdom of Sicily had a strong alliance with the British at this time. And so it really is a hodgepodge of unallied kingdoms. But that purple section there is the bit that we're really going to be talking about tonight. So we'll be talking about, we'll talk about all of it, but this purple bit, which I'm trying to draw a line around, is the Papal States. Now, this is the bit that was given to the Pope by Pepin long, long ago, and then he's kind of held on to it ever since. This is the Pope's temporal power on earth. He has a kingdom, he has land at this point in time. He doesn't have that today. Today, he's got the smallest country in the world, luckily with one of the highest COVID rates. So that's good to see. But nonetheless, any questions? That's quick refresh. Yes. There is, and that's because it came from a number of separate statelets that was stitched together to make, if you like, that kingdom. So there was the territory of Ravenna being one of them. Ravenna, I'm trying to remember what the other ones were. I can look it up and tell you, but there were 3 different kingdoms that got stitched together to make the Papal States. But by this point in time, the Papal States have been the Papal States for so long that those names are kind of dropped and no one really talks about them. It's just the Papal States. So yeah, good question, Chris. Okay, so that's our refresher from last class, or almost all of it. And we're going to see how far we can get this week. So we covered this last class, the open sore. The French Revolution triggers the open sore, opens the wound up, but the wound really is what follows. And this is what's going to ulcerate and hurt all of Europe, not just France. It starts, yes, with men like this guy, Robespierre, who was a true idealist. He really did believe in his cause. But it led to the Reign of Terror, an absolutely horrible situation where thousands were executed summarily, particularly in the territory of the Vendée. Now, the Vendée, as I said, was western France out towards the coast there. And that became a hotbed of royalist, in other words, anti-revolution, revolution. And this was going to be a wound in Europe for a long time to come, and particularly in France for a long time to come. You may have heard of the term the infernal machine. Anyone heard of the term the infernal machine? No? Okay. It was a term that was invented at this point in time, and it was invented because various royalist plots were developed to use an infernal machine to try to kill Napoleon. And they actually got very close to it. They were within about 30 seconds of blowing Napoleon up. But unfortunately, he went too fast, and his wife and her carriage went too slow, and the bomb blew up between them. The bomb that blew up was the infernal machine. And this was part of that weeping, ongoing revolution that affected not just France, but as we saw through various wars and battles and the like, all of Europe. These are all battles that came out of that period, the French Revolution. These were the battles of the First Coalition. We said the First Coalition, in other words, the coalition of nations that wanted to fight against France and put the king back on the throne. And then the wars of the Second Coalition, same again. Same sets of actors trying to fight against France and put the king back on the throne. And this would be an ulcerating sore in Europe. Thousands and thousands of deaths. So that's vial number 1. Vial number 2 is the Sea Vial, the vial that falls upon the sea. And you'll be grateful for this footage, recently uncovered video footage, probably taken by an Egyptian using an early Sony Handycam of some of these battles. Really handy to have live footage of it. But jokes aside, we're told in verse 3 that this vial resulted in the sea becoming as the blood of a dead man. What's the blood of a dead man like? How is it different to the blood of a living man? Congealed, stops moving, turgid. The flow ceases. And this is what was going to happen in this next period of the vials. The trade upon the sea will become, well, there will be no trade upon the sea. And the most significant character in this is going to be this rather repellent person, Lord Nelson. Not a nice man, not a good man, not a godly man, not just a self-aggrandizing man, basically, who is also very, very good at fighting sea battles, and then promoting his own success. But this man was involved in a number of key battles, together with other famous admirals of the time like Jervis and Parker and Hood, that are fundamentally going to stop European trade upon the seas. And when we say the seas, we mean mostly the Atlantic, because the Atlantic was where a lot of this trade was being conducted. Ships coming from South America, from the Indies, across the Atlantic. And so throughout this period, there are a number of very, very significant sea battles. 1798, Napoleon took a whole group of soldiers down to Egypt. Various plans. He wanted to set up a sort of Eastern kingdom in Egypt. He wanted to stop the Indians stop the British getting to India, and a few other things like that. But ultimately, this was a folly, if you like, a crazy idea that Napoleon had: get a whole bunch of ships, a whole lot of soldiers, take them down to Egypt and take over the world. It didn't work particularly well for him. He got down to Egypt and parked his ships, headed in, had a few successes, but unfortunately, about at that point in time, the British found his ships parked out the front of Alexandria. In came Nelson, hard-fought battle, and of poor old Napoleon's fleet, only 4 ships made it away and survived after that particular battle. And this made life extremely difficult for Napoleon, as we'll talk about in a minute. So a bunch of other battles that we could talk about, but and this period, you'll find, if you go looking for imagery of sea battles throughout this period, there's just heaps of them. It's a really big part of particularly of British thinking at this point in time. The images of battles on the high seas. So Napoleon heads down to Egypt. He's doing a bunch of different things. But unfortunately, as we said, he loses his navy. And what then happened for Napoleon is that little by little, the locals, which was the Mamluks, whittled away his power. He didn't lose any major battles. He was actually quite successful, but each successive battle, he lost a few soldiers. He lost a little bit of support in Egypt. He lost a little bit more popularity, and things got worse and worse and worse. He did not have enough to carry all of Egypt. He tried to head up into Turkey and take on Syria. His soldiers caught yellow fever. Things went from bad to worse. He came back, fought a few more battles, and then Napoleon, with a couple of his mates, scuttled up to Alexandria, ostensibly to check out the ships, and hopped on one of the 4 remaining ships and headed home, and left his entire army in Egypt to sort things out for themselves, which is what they had to do. Eventually, they were captured by the British and thoroughly defeated, and finally repatriated to France. But Napoleon, that great leader, completely lost the situation in Egypt. And fundamentally, what wiped him out was the British taking out his navy in Alexandria, or near Alexandria. Soon after this, so in terms of numbers, 45,000 troops arrived on 13 ships of the line, about 300 other small vessels involved in this. Of these, 11 of those 13 ships of the line will be sunk. 2 of the frigates were sunk. Napoleon will flee, and only a small fraction of that 45,000 will ever return home, perhaps as little as 15,000. So huge losses for Napoleon in Egypt. So that was one campaign, one thing that happened on the sea, and that really affected the French ability to navigate the Mediterranean. But this happened as well. So this is the Haitian Revolution. I said this was one of the most grotesque and bloodthirsty struggles. It was fundamentally a slave revolt, the biggest slave revolt in history since Spartacus. And the Haitians, who lived in the most terrible of conditions, far, far worse than what was going on at the same time in the United States of America, like just so much worse. Murder was acceptable if the person murdering was white and the person being murdered was black. That's the level we're talking about. Absolutely corrupt cruelty. And this man led the nation to victory over about, and by nation I mean the Haitian nation, to victory over about 15 years. But in the process, 200,000 Haitians died, 75,000 French soldiers lost their lives, 25,000 French colonists. And this had a terrible effect on French trade, because 25% of the revenue of France came from sugar. And all of that sugar came from Haiti, pardon me. What else? A few other things. We looked at this before. The Spanish made some big mistakes. They allied with Napoleon, fundamentally. And so there are a number of battles in which the British stamped out Spanish trade. So the Battle of St. Vincent is a famous one. That was that was Lord Nelson's first major battle. He defied the orders of Colonel Jarvis, his commander. They had spotted a large Spanish fleet, which they were actually already chasing. They wanted to capture the Spanish fleet because the Spanish fleet was heading from Spain, fundamentally, to South America. And it was carrying mercury. Mercury was highly required in the process of refining silver. And they had to get this mercury to South America so they could refine the silver and bring it back. And so they were willing to take big risks. They knew the British fleet were there, but they had to take this risk to get this mercury across to South America. And they got spotted by the British at a place called Cape St. Vincent. They were going to take a rather cautious approach, sort of just chase the Spanish fleet, because the Spanish fleet was a whole lot bigger than the British fleet. There were 17 ships, I think, in the British fleet and 28, I think, in the Spanish fleet. Which was a bit of a shock to poor old Jarvis. Apparently, he had a guy at the crow's nest looking out at all these sails, and the guy at the crow's nest shouted down 5 sails, and Jarvis was, great, we can handle 5 ships. And then the guy at the crow's nest said 20 sails, and he wasn't so happy about that. And then the guy at the crow's nest said 27 sails. And Jarvis apparently shouted back up, we'll have enough of that, thank you very much. Be it 50 sails, it doesn't matter anymore. The die is cast. And in they went. But Jarvis was going to take a cautious approach. Nelson, a young captain at the time with his first major command, decides that that's not for him and heads straight for the middle of the Spanish fleet. Takes on 6 ships at a time, is busy being pummeled, but manages to get alongside one vessel. He boards it. That vessel happened to crash into another vessel, so he hopped straight from that one onto the next vessel and got 2 ships in one. Managed to capture 2 Spanish vessels from one boarding attempt, which was almost unheard of. And the Battle of St. Vincent resulted in Lord Nelson becoming Lord Nelson. So that was good for him. Another famous battle, we won't go into it in detail, the Battle of Cape Santa Maria. What had happened is that under the French had signed a secret agreement with the Spanish. This agreement obliged Spain to pay France 72 million francs every year until they declared war on Britain. So it was kind of like an incentive for them to declare war on Britain. It wasn't particularly secret. The British happened to know about it and they decided to push the issue. So they went again hunting for the Spanish treasure fleet coming from this time Uruguay to Spain. They managed to find that fleet. They completely blew up one of the vessels. They captured 3 of the other vessels. And in the process, they captured 4.2 million Spanish dollars, as well as 15,000 ingots of gold and plenty of other stuff, approximately $128 million worth in these 4 ships. Just imagine what would happen if Western Australia lost 128 million. Well, actually, we could probably afford it at the moment, but under normal circumstances, that would not be a good thing. And so trade dried up. One journal said it is well known that as a consequence, the great seaports of the continent, which have been hubs of economic life, were completely crippled from 1807 onwards. And going through some of the records, you see massive drops in industry in Europe as a consequence of this. Rope makers in Bordeaux, before the French Revolution, 700. After the blockade of the English, none at all. The entire industry died out. Earthenware made in Delft and famously in Belgium, I think. Very, very big trade before this all happened. Complete ruin after the British blockade. Industrial output of Marseille, 50 million francs before this, 12 million francs after. And so trade dried up. The American consul to Bordeaux said this: from the Baltic to the archipelago, nothing but despair and misery is to be seen. Grass is seen growing in the streets of this city, an indicator that nothing was driving up and down the streets. Its beautiful port is deserted except by 2 Marblehead fishing schooners and 3 or 4 empty vessels which still swing in the tide. The blood of a dead man. Trade completely stopped and European wealth and industry collapsed over a period of 4 or 5 years. And then the third angel poured out its vial upon the rivers and upon the mountains. And really this is about Napoleon's various campaigns through those mountain regions. His first Italian campaign, a staggering campaign to read about. He marched through the Alps with many of his soldiers not even having proper footwear, certainly not having proper jackets, lots of them without even weapons, and won these staggering victories at the foot of the Alps on the other side in what is today Italy. This painting was commissioned in response to another painting I'll show you fairly soon, to give a realistic picture of what it would have been like for Napoleon crossing the Alps. And what you can see there is a rather cold and unhappy looking Napoleon crossing the Alps, and it would have been absolutely grueling. But when they got to the other side, they won a series of staggering victories because they could move faster than the European armies. And the European armies, particularly those of the Austrian Empire, were decimated, such that fairly soon they were pushed into what was called the Treaty of Tolentino, which forced them to cede all their Italian territories to Napoleon. There was also this, following that, the War of the Pyrenees, in which multiple wars, again, were fought throughout that mountainous region, but now closer to Spain. We won't go through that in detail. This is the image I was telling you about. This was the French image. The other image I showed you was a British image. Neither of them are intended to be insulting. They're both intended to be realistic, but this one perhaps a little bit more than realistic. And Napoleon looks particularly glorious. This was so famous that it was hung in Paris, and people used to come, have day outings to come and see this painting. But you'll see that it says that this vial was poured upon the waters and they became blood, indicative of death and bloodshed in this region as brought on by the many, many battles that were fought by Napoleon and others in this region. And just, you can see the dot points here of battle after battle after battle throughout this region, each of them with their own losses of life and death and loss of industry in this territory. Now, we might say to ourselves, well, what's going on with this one? Well, this one is a little bit different because verse 5 and 6, the angel of the waters has got something to say. The other angels, at least for the first 5, don't speak, but this one does. And he says, this judgment is right. It is the right judgment, O Lord. And he speaks to Christ, the one who art and wast and is to come. And he says, thou hast judged thus. This is absolutely appropriate because they shed the blood of saints and prophets. Thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy of this terrible destruction that was going to go on in their region. How were they worthy? In ways that the rest of France and the rest of Europe were not. Well, here's how. This is a British poet writing about a massacre that occurred on April the 24th in 1655. It was an order given to begin an attack on the people. The people were the Protestant believers in the territory of Piedmont. Now you might say, okay, well, where's Piedmont? Piedmont, that's Piedmont. That territory there where those battles were fought is Piedmont. So this piece of poetry and this event occurs in Piedmont. It's said that the Catholic forces went beyond reason attacking the Protestants in this area, who were called at the time the Waldensians. They are reported to have unleashed an unprovoked campaign of looting, rape, torture, and murder. The estimated number of people who were killed were 2,000, and another 2,000 forced at the point of a sword to convert to Catholicism. Now, I'm going to put up an image in a minute, and I'm going to take it right back down because it's not an image anyone wants to look at for very long, but it's an image, a contemporary image from the 1660s that records what happened. And bear in mind, at the time this image was drawn, it wasn't drawn to commemorate a crime, it was drawn to celebrate a victory. These are Protestants being dealt with in Piedmont by Catholic rioters, effectively. And this poet, an English poet, writes, "Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered slain whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains, cold." This is exactly the territory we're talking about, the sources of the rivers and of the fountains. "Even them who kept thy truth so pure of old, when all our fathers worshipped stocks and stones, forget not. In thy book record their groans." They're right here in this passage. "Who were thy sheep, and in their ancient fold, slain by the bloody Piedmontese that rolled mother with infant down the rocks," and on it goes. It's just the most horrific and tragic and sad thing. This was conducted in this territory, and this is why this angel says, this is right. This is just. This territory became predominantly Catholic because they slaughtered our brothers and sisters in this area. And the fact that the Spirit says this tells us that these people were our brothers and sisters. They were saints and prophets. They will be in the kingdom, many of them. And they were killed for the act of hiding in the Alps, because that's what they were doing. They built communities far away from Catholicism to try and stay safe, and the Catholics came and slaughtered them. This is another event at a place called Merindol, the massacre of Merindol, 1545, thousands killed. And this image shows one Christian being thrown off the top of the cliffs to her death. That stone says, and you can't read it, I know, but it says, "In memory of the Waldensians who died for their faith." Now you might say, well, where is Merindol? Well, Merindol is in the same territory. It's just round the curve of the Alps, a little bit more further towards Spain. For those of you who know France, it's just north of Marseille. And I'll draw a circle around the territory just to make it really clear. It's this area, sort of in here. So Merindol is in here. It's the territory, the broad territory. Merindol is a village, but the territory itself was called Vaucluse. And Vaucluse is named after the Fontaine de Vaucluse. It's a spring. And the whole area is named after a spring. And it was the famous place where a terrible massacre of Christians occurred, of true Christians. You might say, okay, well, is there anything more to it than that? Well, remember we talked about Papal States. And when we looked at that, I had this map up, and I don't know if you noticed, but you can see the green territory of the Papal State. There's another little green spot. Can you see that other little green spot? Well, that's this territory. The overall territory in which Marindol and Vaucluse sit is called Avignon. That's the capital city, and it was to the territory at the time. And it was owned by the Pope. He actually ruled from this territory for about 100 years, moved out of Rome and ruled from Avignon. And Avignon had been this papal dominion of various different flavors for a very, very long time. What happened in addition to the battles and the wars of Napoleon is that the revolutionaries invaded Avignon and forced in a new municipal government. They expelled the papal legate, demanded that Avignon be reunited with France, that it no longer be a papal state, etc., etc. The outcome of this was virtually a civil war. And then in this superheated atmosphere, people started telling stories, get this, of the Madonna bleeding tears from her eyes, or tears of blood from her eyes. And so a group of papists, that is papal people, lynched the local administrator. The response of that was that the revolutionaries came in and slaughtered 60 Catholics and threw them. I'll put up the image. This is the massacre. I'm not going to read it, but the massacre of Vaucluse, fundamentally, where 60 Catholic people were massacred and thrown into the papal dungeon. And then, following that, the Pope was forced to renounce his claim to Avignon in a famous treaty called the Treaty of Tolentino, in which the Pope renounces purely and simply all the rights to which he may lay claim over the city and territory of Avignon. It becomes part of the Republic. And the letter there actually is that treaty, in which it is signed at the bottom by Bonaparte and by the representative of the Pope. So this territory, which massacred our brothers and sisters, ends up having its own anti-papal massacre and then being given back to Republican France. And the Spirit says this is just so right. It's as it should be. Any questions? Not a pleasant section, that one. And then on to the Sun Vial. So we read there that it says, the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. So the sun is going to be judged, but then we've got this other being in this verse. You notice that power was given unto, not it, it's not talking about the sun, because the sun's not a him. Power was given unto another him to scorch men with fire. The sun will be judged, and a him will be given power to scorch. And men were scorched with great heat and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues. They still didn't repent. So what's that about? Well, following these events, we've had the Reign of Terror. We've had the ongoing open wound that came out of that, the War of the First Coalition, the War of the Second Coalition, the ongoing blockade of the British of all European trade, and it was all European trade. You've got then the wars of Napoleon as he fought his way firstly across the Alps and kind of cut off the rest of Italy from the Hungarian Empire, which it was a part of at this time. He then fought his way through Spain, brought Spain to its knees, and then he turns his attention eastward against, well, he actually wanted to capture some German territories. Germany at this time wasn't Germany as we know it. Again, it was a patchwork of states. and he was going to take on some German territories and try and get himself a little bit of a buffer state. And then being Napoleon, he thought, well, that's kind of not enough. And he decided to take out the Austro-Hungarian Holy Roman Empire altogether. And so he marched eastward. And this very famous picture is from the conclusion of a very famous battle. The battle is called the Battle of Austerlitz. It was fought on the 2nd of December, 1805. And it was known otherwise as the Battle of Three Emperors. It was a very decisive victory for Napoleon, but it was known as the Battle of Three Emperors because Napoleon beat Russian armies and Austrian armies in this one battle. The Austrian emperor was represented and the Russian emperor was represented. Now you might think to yourself, what on earth was the Russian emperor doing sending soldiers to this battle so far away from his border? Why would he care? It's part of this whole process of the punishment of Europe. Napoleon, you'll remember we said Napoleon invaded Egypt. When he invaded Egypt, he on his way down, he invaded Malta. He decided it would be a great idea to set up a republican kingdom in Malta. So first leg of his trip down to Egypt was drop into Malta, and Malta was ruled by the Knights Templar of Malta, a very, very ancient order that went all the way back to the Crusaders, but they happened to have a famous sponsor, someone who paid them money to stay in power, and his name just happened to be the Tsar of Russia. And so when Napoleon marched in there, kicked out the Knights Templar, and in little more than a week, completely revamped the government, the education system, and the social security services of Napoleon, of Malta, literally did all of those things in about a week before hopping back on his boats and heading to Egypt. He made an enemy for life out of the Emperor of Russia. The Emperor of Russia was quite unimpressed that the Knights Templar had been kicked out. And so this is why he was on the battlefield on this particular occasion. There's more to it than that, but that's enough for tonight. So in this particular battle, Napoleon is fighting, and it's a very, very misty morning. The sun is not yet sort of broken through the mist, and the armies are fighting through mist, and it's very difficult conditions. It's hard to see who's where. And Napoleon made his leading troops feign weakness. They started abandoning all these strong points, tempting the enemy to attack his right flank. And it worked. The Austrians sort of started depleting the center of their sort of attack line to move their soldiers around to attack the right flank. And that was the point where Napoleon said, now would be a great moment. Why don't we go for the middle of their army? They're coming around to attack us on the side. We're going to go straight through the middle. So at about 8:45, Napoleon, satisfied that the enemy was now weak in the center, he said to his general, how long is it going to take for your men to get up to the top of this hill where the Austrians are? And Napoleon said, less than 20 minutes. The general said, less than 20 minutes, sire. 15 minutes later, Napoleon said, attack. And he apparently said one sharp blow and the war will be over. And he was right. This dense fog was clouding the whole battle. His soldiers charged up the middle to the top of the hill. As they got to the top of the hill, they cracked open the line of Austrians, and the mist lifted and the sun came down, and people talked forever after about the sun of Austerlitz. It's almost like the sun started shining just as that victory was won. So much so legendary was it that people began to call Napoleon the son of Austerlitz. You can get the book. Now, this is actually a novel, but it's a historically based novel called The Son of Austerlitz, talking about his victory on this particular occasion. And this incredible victory resulted in the abdication of the son. The Holy Roman Emperor abdicated, and that was the end of him. Well, wasn't his death, but it was certainly the end of him as an emperor of the Holy Roman Empire as an outcome of this particular battle. A little bit prior to this, a new beast had started to rise. Here's the hymn. Napoleon had had himself crowned emperor of the French. Now, importantly, he wasn't emperor of France. He was the emperor of the French because he wanted to have a more sort of global meaning. He wanted to be emperor of the French wherever they might be, and he saw himself as spreading French influence throughout the world. He was crowned with a brand new crown. The royal crown of the Bourbons had been destroyed during the Revolution. So he had a brand new crown made for himself, but he called it the crown of Charlemagne. And famously, he crowned himself. Now, there was never any design for the Pope to crown him. You may have heard stories that he snatched the crown out of the Pope's hand and crowned himself. That's not what happened, but he did blackmail the Pope to attend. He actually said to the Pope, if you come along and lend legitimacy to this event, I will give you back some of the territories that France has confiscated from you. And then after this, reneged on that promise. But nonetheless, the Pope showed up. He was very grumpy for the entire event and witnessed the crowning of Napoleon. And some of you may have seen this very, very famous painting of Napoleon and the people looking on and seeing Napoleon be crowned on that particular event. All sorts of interesting characters in the audience looking at this crowning of Napoleon. The image you're seeing actually there, I think, is the crowning of Josephine, if I'm right, his wife at the time. Any questions from that? Yes, Simon. Yes, that's right. Someone's managed time travel. Extra points if you can spot who. Yes, I just thought that would be entertaining. It made me smile anyway. For those of you who are not sure what Simon's talking about, this nefarious looking character, oh, my pen's not working all of a sudden. Let's try again. So it's this nefarious character here. Now, it's not drawing, but you can probably see where I'm pointing. No? This devious character here in the audience. Anyway, that's me. Yeah, I did another talk a long time ago about what it would be like to be in the kingdom, and I photoshopped myself into a whole lot of old paintings. Egyptian hieroglyphics and things like that, I photoshopped myself in to sort of say, imagine if you were present at all of these events through history. That's a topic for another time. Okay, so finally, we're on to the fifth seal. The fifth angel pours out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain and blasphemed God, the God of heaven, because of their pains and their sores, but they repented not. So, any ideas? What is this seat of the beast on which this vial is going to be poured? Yeah, Uncle Kim? The Ottoman Empire. That's a pretty good guess. I'm going to take a slightly different direction, Uncle Kim, on that one. We should talk about that one over supper. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. The seat of the beast is the European beast. So the seat or the throne of the European beast is the Pope's seat. The Papal States. Yes, finally we come to the Papal States, and we kind of prefigured we were going to get here by showing you each of the places that have a vial upon which that would be poured upon them. So this happened. Ooh, that's quite windy. This happened in a number of sort of waves. It didn't happen overnight. There was wave after wave of difficulty for the Pope and the Papal States. In 1796, so this is way back when Napoleon is just a general. He's not yet even consul. He's certainly not emperor. French Republican troops under Napoleon invaded Italy, defeated the papal troops, and occupied a bunch of papal states and territories. Now, Pope Pius at the time sued for peace, and that was what was granted at Tolentino, and we talked about that. But what happened after that, having sort of forced the Pope to give Napoleon what he wanted, and by the way, what Napoleon wanted was to be king in his own right. He actually wasn't looking to be a great big general of the French. He actually became a king of Italy, not the king of Italy, but a king of Italy for about 2 years throughout this period before heading back to France and getting another job. And he managed to do this by taking some of the papal states and forcing the Pope to give him that territory. And in addition, blackmailing the Pope to give him a whole lot of money. So poor old Pope Pius sued for peace. But then on December the 28th of the same year in which Pope Pius gave Napoleon everything he wanted, there was this riot, and the riot was blamed on papal forces. The papal forces blamed the riot on Italian and French revolutionaries. And then what happened was a famous French soldier had gone to visit Rome as part of a French ambassadorial visit, and he got killed. No one really knows how. It may have been just in a drunken brawl, but Napoleon basically said, well, that's enough, and he invaded. He invaded a second time. He actually sent his chief of staff. It's quite something, isn't it? Oh, well. He sent his chief of staff, a man by the name of General Berthier. Now, General Berthier was his chief of staff. Now, what does that mean? It means that he was not a general in any other way other than name. He was the guy who was responsible for ensuring that all of the soldiers had sufficient clothing and jackets and guns and munitions. It was his job to make sure that communication worked successfully. He ran the camp of Napoleon. But General Berthier was sent by Napoleon because he was an absolutely trustworthy source. He marched into Rome completely unopposed in 1798, and he proclaimed a Roman Republic, and he demanded the Pope renounce his temporal power. The Pope refused. He said, I'm a king on earth. He was taken prisoner and died about 6 weeks later in 1799. I said that it happened in a number of waves, because what then happened is the relationship kind of was pretty bad at this point, but it picked up. Napoleon decided he needed the Pope, and he needed his help, because what Napoleon wanted to do is he wanted to unify France. And at the time, there were kind of two sides of France. There was kind of the Catholic sort of royalist side of France, and there was the non-Catholic Republican side of France. And he wanted to bring them together again. He said, revolution, we've had enough of that. It's time to bring France back together. And it's time that everyone said I was emperor. That would be a really good thing. That would be a great outcome. And he realized that in order to unify everyone behind him, he was going to need the help of a little bit of religion. And the only religion going around was Catholicism. But of course, not only had he captured the Pope, and then the Pope had accidentally died, but he'd also taken all papal territory across France, including, as we saw, Avignon. And so the Pope wasn't really open to supporting the Pope, supporting Napoleon to become the emperor. And so what Napoleon did is he paid the Pope. He paid the Pope, as we said. He blackmailed him to come. He had a whole bunch of things he gave him. But among the things he gave him was this beautiful papal tiara. Now, this papal tiara was given to the Pope in recognition of the Pope's attendance at Napoleon's coronation. It was lavishly decorated with jewels. It was made of gold and of silver. And here's the thing, Napoleon had deliberately made it so that it was too small to wear. He'd also deliberately made it so that if anyone tried to wear it, it was so heavy, you would only be able to wear it for minutes. Unfortunately, the new Pope didn't seem to get the joke, and he actually sent a thank you note. So that's rather sad. I put these images up because I think they illustrate the seat of the beast. These are two different thrones of the Pope. This one here, many of you will have seen it if you've been to Rome, is the single largest chunk of brass in the world. I think that is a beautiful piece of irony because we know what brass represents in the Bible. And here's the other piece of beautiful irony in that particular structure, that sort of cover for the throne there. It's made of brass which was recovered from an ancient building. It was stripped off the roof of the Pantheon of all the Greek gods. And so they took the brass from the old faith that traces its beliefs all the way back to Babylon. And with that, they built the throne for the beast. I think that's marvelous in its poetry. But nonetheless, Napoleon hasn't finished with the Pope. In 1809, Napoleon issued 2 decrees in which he reproached the popes for the ill use they had made of the Papal States, the donation of Charlemagne, who he described as his august predecessor. And he declared that those territories which were still under the direct control of the Papal States were now annexed to the French Empire. And that was it for papal power for the Pope. Yes. Yeah, so that other one, I can't remember what the name of it is. It is somewhere in, does anyone else know what that other one is? It is another one of his particular thrones in a different church. It's not the Church of John's Lateran, but it kind of reminds me of that one. We can Google it after the class. I'm sure we'll find out which throne, but it's another one of his thrones. I have no idea. I probably knew when I got the photo some time ago, but I can't remember now. Yeah. Well, the normal process. So after they found out that Pope Pius, I think the 6th, had passed away while in prison, they had a, what do they call it? Not a synod. Yeah, where all the cardinals come together and vote. You know, they get put in a room, they vote, and they keep on voting. And as long as black smoke is coming out, everyone knows that the voting papers that are being burnt have not yet selected a pope. When the white smoke comes out, everyone cheers because, yeah, we have a new pope. That thing. So not as I understand it, no. And certainly the way the popes from here on behaved, they were only beholden to Napoleon insofar as that he held all the strings. France was the heartland of Catholicism. The eldest son of the church was absolutely true of France. And even after the revolution, France was incredibly Catholic. That was one of Napoleon's big battles, to deal with that. And in the end, he realized he could not de-Catholicize France. So what he did is he co-opted the Pope. And the bigger picture was he actually went and made a deal with the Pope that forced the Pope to sign away a number of his rights. So he said, look, we'll accept priests. You can have priests. You can have some of your land back, not all of it. And you can run the Catholic system just as you did back in the old days. But you must let us decide whether we accept your priests. We get to turn them away if we don't like them. So you get the first vote and we get the second veto. So the Pope was left kind of toothless in France, because if he annoyed Napoleon would just start kicking out priests. And there was nothing that the Pope could do about that. So it became a kind of controlled state religion under Napoleon. Napoleon was very pragmatic about everything. He knew he couldn't get Catholicism out of the hearts of people. He himself was somewhere around agnostic. He even said during his Egyptian campaign that he might convert to Islam. He saw some good stuff in Islam. He went so far as trying to convince his men to be circumcised while in Egypt, because if they did so, then the local population would accept them as appropriate rulers, and they couldn't accept them if they weren't Islamic. And that wasn't going to happen without circumcision. And as you can imagine, the French soldiers were not particularly keen on that little idea of Napoleon's. So that's one reason that campaign didn't succeed. Any other questions or comments? No? All right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Look, our next vial is going to talk about the way of the kings of the East being prepared. And there's a real flow of thought there, isn't there? That we will be involved in the 6th and the 7th vial, but we wouldn't have even existed if the 1st to the 5th hadn't occurred. You know, the sort of crushing of papal strength was essential, because up until this point, even Britain was still beholden to the Pope. Until the French Revolution and the events that followed, Britain still, despite generations of being Protestant, had to toe the line of the Pope. So yeah, really important point. Thanks for that, Chris. Cool. So next class, I think that's November. So a little while from now, we're gonna follow our next into our next few vials. And we said there was a parallel between the trumpets and the vials. And one of the parallels was that the trumpets start with the Western Roman Empire, and then the searchlight of the Spirit turns east. And the same happens in these vials to a degree. So what we're going to see, we've been focusing here on Europe for the first 5 vials, but the searchlight of Christ's attention and of the judgment is going to move east, and so we'll go and follow that in our next class.
Right, thank you, Dan, for this evening. We'll close with hymn 268 and a word of prayer. Our great Almighty God in the heavens, we again draw nigh unto thee, to praise thee, to praise all thy purpose with this earth, thy plan and purpose with this earth, as we look forward to that day when thy Son returns, that thou has shown us in his book, in his letter to us, of those things which bring the nations towards these latter days, and that we can see these things and be encouraged to prepare ourselves to be ready as we see the dawn of a new age coming upon this earth. We pray that thou would be with us to that end. We thank thee for thy many good gifts that we have of food and clothing and shelter and all those things that are from thy hand. We pray that thou would help us to put these things into service to worship thee. We thank thee and ask for thy care in thy Son's name, the future King, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.